In the second episode of Humans and AI, I had the pleasure of interviewing Yohei Nakajima, VC and founder of Untapped Capital. Yohei talks about his fascinating background from growing up in Seattle to studying in Japan and working in the startup community in LA. Yohei shares how he got into VC and his experience working at a venture fund before starting his own. He also discusses his exciting projects such as Ask Anything VC, Mini Yohei, and Baby AGI. Lastly, he talks about the benefits of building in public, such as meeting new people and learning faster, and the other amazing projects he's worked on outside of VC. Awesome, Yohei, welcome to our show.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure. And I know we caught up a couple of weeks ago and I had a chance to meet you one-on-one for the first time. And it was so interesting just learning about your work as a VC. And I'm super, super interested to dive into some of the work that you're doing. And eventually we'll get to Baby AGI, which is the top of mind for lots and lots of folks. But curious, what is the background? Where do you get to where you are today as the most active VCs that I've ever seen in terms of just like getting plugged into the world of AI and LLMs? I'm just curious to hear about the origin story in your words.
Yeah, I was born in Tokyo, raised in Seattle. Moved to Seattle when I was 2. Grew up in the US, but as a Japanese guy. Went to high school in Japan. So that was a wild shock trying to figure out how I fit into a new culture. And then went to college in California, a little more laid back and relaxed. I feel like that actually says a lot about me, just like the fact that I went from Seattle to Japan to California. I lived in California for about 10 years, and then now I'm back in Seattle.
There's a lot of jumping around there. I'm curious, like, what was the sort of motivation for the moves each of those times?
In high school, it was not my choice, but it was really to help me understand the Japanese culture was the reason, and I do much more now. Moving to California, I knew I always wanted to go back to the US for college. California has great sunshine, so that was a great place to go to college. Stuck around there. I had a lot of friends in the LA area. I got really active in the LA startup community, which probably dives more into how I became a venture capitalist. Right now I live in Seattle, but more for family reasons.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm curious to learn about LA. So during your, I guess, your stay in LA, how long was that? And you mentioned that was maybe your entryway into venture. LA, obviously, there is a strong startup community there, but most people, I think, associate SF as being the place in California for VC startups. And so curious, like the community you got plugged into in LA and how that sort of helped shape your career.
So there wasn't much of a community when I joined. It was around 2009. I graduated in 2009, worked on my own startup, made every mistake possible. Biggest mistake was that I did not surround myself with other founders and mentors. My first event that I went to was a startup weekend and the energy was incredible. I got obsessed with the idea of just surrounding myself with founders. At that point, there was one co-working space and maybe one event a week. So I just dove into the LA startup community. I started hosting events, meetups, worked for a couple co-working spaces, running educational programming for founders. And so that was really when I dove in and became the community guy. And at that point, and kind of relevant to now, I always did side things like I set up a tech calendar for tech events in LA because I was interested in events. So I put that into a resource and shared it, which meant a whole bunch of event organizers started reaching out, which grew my network. And I think just throughout my career, I've always had little side projects that helped my main career.
Incredible. And that's one of the things that I find especially impressive about you is how plugged in you are with these side projects. And obviously some of them have taken on a life of their own. And so we'll dive into that later. But when you were getting plugged into the LA community, meeting these startups, founders, and throwing these community events, what were you doing at the time? Were you a developer? Were you somebody that wasn't a developer, but was interested in tech at the time?
I was not a developer. Like I coded as a hobby, but I've never been no one's ever paid me to write code. I was a community organizer. Like the stuff I was doing was checking people in, stacking chairs. That was my stuff and I enjoyed it. I was going to events, showing up early and seeing if I could help. I'd be like, oh, I'll do check-in, right? Because then you can meet everybody and everyone sees you as a familiar face. Stick around and stack chairs. And if you helped events, the event organizers knew all the people in the community because they set up speakers. So they would introduce you to people. So it was just a lot of just being out there, connecting with people. I could just focus on just meeting people really.
So you're throwing these events in LA and that was your gateway to venture.
Techstars was coming to LA and I found out at that point, right, accelerators were exciting, but there weren't that many. So I was really excited to join them. It was coincidence. Cody, who was brought on to run the Disney accelerator, started working out of the co-working spaces I was working at. So total coincidence that I connected with him and I bugged him until he brought me onto the team. And that was my first foray into investment where I got to sit alongside experienced investors, Disney, looking at media and entertainment startups and deciding which ones to invest in and support.
I'm curious to learn more about that gig at Walt Disney Company. How did that play a role in where you are today?
It's definitely different being on the investor side as being on the founder side. side. A company like Disney just operated completely differently from the way I operated. Fast and loose, not really planning, just go fast. Disney is the polar opposite, but we're working in an environment where you had to balance the two, and trying to get startups to work with Disney was incredible. And fascinatingly, over the course of the time I worked with Disney, I really learned to appreciate all the thought they put into planning. And so I feel like that was definitely transformative in many ways. And that led me to being the first director of pipeline at Techstars. Techstars at the time was getting to about 30 programs. Each program was responsible for their own sourcing strategy. And so I was brought on as the first central resource to support with startup sourcing. And one of the areas that I found I could add the most value was implementing an outbound strategy. I was the outbound guy across all 30 Techstars programs, where if a program was about to kick off applications, I would go scour the internet and find like a short list of 100 to 200 companies that I thought that program should reach out to based on what the program said they were looking for.
How would that look different today with AI, that whole process?
I think you'd be a lot more efficient. You could do a lot more automated matching tags, right? If any company, I was already doing a little bit of that, right? If there was a mobility tag, I would tag it mobility program, right? But definitely AI could accelerate that.
So how did you eventually land? What happened in between there and then Untapped VC? What was the journey in between there?
I went to work for a venture fund, Scrum Ventures, based in the Bay Area, really close ties to Japan. By the time I left Techstars, I knew I wanted to start a fund at some point. I thought I'd go experience what it was to work at a fund and learn all the ropes, and I did. And when this idea of Untapped kind of popped in my head, I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I went to Scrum and said, I'm gonna go start a fund, and they were supportive from day one, and here we are.
What's like the thought process that goes into creating your own fund? What was the most appealing aspect?
I think it starts with, right, when I got into the startup community, I realized that for the rest of my life, I wanted to be surrounded by founders. Like the founder energy is what I really just wanted to surround myself with. And then when I worked for Techstars, I realized that being an investor is an incredible position where you get to support them with capital and you get to spend time with them and help them grow. And I think that's really what made me want to become a VC. And I think if you look at venture capital, it's mostly small funds led by a few people who are driving the direction of the fund. Being somebody who's never really wants to do things his own way, it was pretty obvious to me that at some point I would have to do my own fund.
And looking at how you build in public today and looking at the fact that your role at Untapped, it seems like you're doing a little bit of both. You're a founder and you're a VC. You're getting a little bit of experience in both of those things, where not only are you helping to create opportunities for founders, but you're also building really cool applications as well. I feel that you're able to scratch both of those itches of being in the trenches and then also supporting folks in the trenches and getting the sort of energy from them.
Anybody who's starting a fund is a founder, because you have to set up so much around the fund. You have to set up operations and strategies. So even without the side projects, if I think about myself as a founder, I think of myself as a founder of Untapped. What I do have is a fun hobby of building, which is really fun. It's something that when I set up the fund, I knew from day one we wanted our custom CRM. And I actually started coding it initially. I was chipping away at PHP MySQL because that's what I knew from high school. And then I realized this is not the right use of my time, and no code was blowing up. And I thought, you know what, I should just commit to no code and see if I can build a CRM in no code. And I did it publicly because I was sitting alone in my room and lonely. So I was like, I'm just going to live tweet as I build stuff. And what happened was that it turned into this flywheel of no code founders reaching out because they're like, oh, I see you're doing stuff with no code. VCs are sending me their no code deals. And I was like, all right, this building public stuff is cool. I should just publicly tweet whatever I can as long as it's legal. Interestingly, building a fund, there's a lot of stuff you can't talk about. As a matter of fact, most of the stuff I work on a day-to-day basis, I can't really talk about publicly. A lot of VCs tweet advice, right? Which is what we can talk about. But there's a lot of advice out there. And I realized that this build in public is a unique angle that I could lean in on. So I did that with Web3 and then with AI. And it serves both to meet people, but also to learn about the technologies.
You mentioned Web3. What was your foray into Web3?
So I launched an NFT collection, a 10K PFP project called Pixel Beasts, where I already did all the art. And we had a whole bunch of founders and VCs exploring and learning about Web3. We were the first integration into a two-dimensional pixel game called Pixels. We were the first integration out of, now there's, I think, 50 or something, and lots of, I think, 15K daily active users. We have it run around as Pixel Beasts. So it's been really cool to just have that as a fun thing to explore and learn.
Very cool. And in terms of AI, I'm looking at put together a timeline of your interesting work in the space. And the earliest project that I think I can see here is the askanything.vc. Is that the earliest project you did?
So that was not AI, really. That was really just a programmatic Google search wrapped up. So I think the first AI one would be Mini Yohei, the VC expert that I did in August.
Tell us more about that. I know there was a few iterations of it. There was also a Mini Yohei that came out, Mini Yohei 2.0. that
Yeah,
came out a little
yes.
bit later?
So initially when I started playing with GPT-3, I realized that if I gave it a little prompt wrapper, it would actually do a pretty good job of giving advice, like pretty good VC advice, especially for the more common questions that are asked. I basically wrapped, this was back in August, right? Very early LLM days, I wrapped GPT-3 in a wrapper that said, you're a VC expert based on the following question from a founder, what answer would you provide? And it was just a little simple text box with a button. I put it in our founder portal for our portfolio companies to use, and I set it up so that I would be CC'd on the email that went to them. And so what happened was fascinating. Like when they asked the AI a question, they'd get an immediate response from the AI, and then I would have a chance to respond to it. So I saw this was my first kind of like understanding of augmented intelligence, or kind of the augmented approach, where AI alone would be fast, but sometimes inaccurate. Human alone is more accurate, but slow. But when you combine both, they get the immediate answer and the more thoughtful answer later. And I thought that was pretty powerful.
What was the reception from the founders? What percentage of them would you say were satisfied with the answer that Mini Yohei gave? And how many of them maybe followed up saying, hey, we want a little bit more from the man himself?
In most cases, I think I responded before they would respond, because I saw it as like my response was part of the answer. The response was good. It was pretty experimental. People jumped in and played around. I don't know if people use it as too many times, but a lot of founders experimented. I think probably the bigger benefit was making them aware of the technology at that early stage. It was a few months before ChatGPT, so at least they were aware of this technology coming. The blog post drafting tool that I stuck in our founder portal right after was used a lot. I think it was used like 60 times, 100 times in the first month or so. So people were drafting blog post ideas, again, early days of LLM stuff, but it was really cool to see and engage with founders in that new way, where I was getting insight into the questions they would ask an AI, insight into the blog post they were thinking about posting. So it was really fascinating. Use AI to both help and build a relationship with founders in a way that didn't exist before.
That's incredible. I just love that you took the domain you're operating in and leveraged these tools, just dove right into just find a solution that not only adds value from your own perspective, it potentially saves you some time and having some words in terms of the advice you need to share, but also is a huge value add, I'm sure, for founders as well. I really admired that. And then there was a second version of Mini Yuhei that came out later on, 2.0, that I think was grounded in VC blog posts and also had citations.
So that goes back to the askanything.vc, which was the programmatic Google search that only gave you answers from VC blogs. And it was a really helpful tool that I used often when answering questions from founders. I think there's no one answer in startup life, so I have my opinions, but I like to share blog posts from other VCs as alternate opinions, or here's a vast scope of ways to think about the question you're asking. And when I was playing with, I think it was Dust that I used for that one, I noticed they had this web search agent that was a template where it would do a web search and give you cited answers. And I thought, I think if I just swap out the Google search with the Ask Anything programmatic search, it would only give answers from VC blogs. And I just tested it out and it worked. So I called that Mini Yohei 2.0 or 2.1, I guess now.
What was the aha moment for you in AI? A time that you were like, this is pretty cool, and this is something that I need to share with the world.
And it was, I think, when I saw DALL-E Midjourney popping up. I think it was even before Stable Diffusion was announced. And I got myself into the Midjourney Discord server and I started playing around. I was like, this is amazing. Got access to DALL-E, started playing with it. So I did a couple of projects on the text image. And once I had a DALL-E account, that's when I realized, oh, I'm one step away from this other AI stuff. Maybe I should play around with it. And I remember the first time I started playing with it, I thought, uh-oh, this is going to take up some of my time. But it's been in a good way.
It's pretty remarkable how far the technology has come, foundational models over the past few years, and ChatGPT really just bringing all the progress to the public has been incredible. And sort of building in public and building on top of some of these foundational models, it sounds like there's a lot of just added benefits in a lot of ways. It's not easy. You have to be vulnerable. You're building fairly complex things as well. What makes it worthwhile, sort of the reach that you might get, right? Obviously, you've been able to create an incredible audience on Twitter, and you've become a staple in the AI community. And I've been seeing Baby AGI and all your work for quite some time now. And we featured a bunch of your work in Notabot as well. So there's a bunch of benefits. What would you say is the biggest reason that you continue to build in public?
So we say that we build in public to meet and learn. And I think it's those two things, because those two go hand in hand. When I'm learning on my own, it starts to plateau pretty quickly in terms of like creativity, like what to look at next. It's quickly plateaus, but when you build in public, you get so many ideas. Like I started getting ideas from other people reach out. And so you learn faster. People comment things that you don't understand. And you're like, okay, I guess I got to go research that. So there's a learning. But in the end, life's about the people, right? It's the founders I meet. I've even met investors who are interested in investing in our fund. So there's just a lot of benefit to meeting people. They're doing something fun and exciting.
That's very important for sure. And it's a fun fun time to be building as well. Just such powerful
It is.
tools
I
at
think
our
I think
tips.
about a third of my projects are not VC related at all. A third of my projects have just been fun. Like I have a Twitter mini Yohei that returns all my tweets into a poem and posts it.
And so you worked on a few projects since Mini Yohei. It looks like seeing there was Brain Dump, there was the Airtable text to template. Dashdoor was almost like a set of different tools that you put together,
Yeah, I called
connecting
it Dash Dash. That was my internal
Sorry.
dashboard tool. Yes, that has my calendar, task list, CRM, GPT-3 chatbot all in a single mobile-friendly dashboard.
Yeah, I remember seeing that on Twitter as well. There was Text Camera, there was Book Illustrator, CSV Analyzer. But the thing that I think has maybe picked up the most steam, it's the newest project for you, but it's the one that it has just completely taken over my Twitter timeline, is Baby AGI, and where Baby AGI comes from, which was the task-driven autonomous agent
Yep.
that you had created. Tell us a story of how that started and how you built it and how it just took off fire.
I feel like there's a lot of ideas around having an AI run a company that I'd come across, right? There was a company in China that assigned an AI as their CEO, or I think it was a subsidiary that was performing well. And then I saw Hustle GPT, where people were using ChatGPT as their co-founder. Right? And I actually really wanted to try the Hustle GPT, but I don't have time. And I thought, I wonder if I could just do the Hustle GPT, but not be the person. Like, can I just let ChatGPT-3 be a founder? And in my mind, I was like, okay, how would I design that? I was like, okay, so it needs to execute tasks. It needs to come up with new tasks based on those task results. And then it needs to reprioritize to make sure it's doing the next task. And I basically described that into ChatGPT, just like prototype it. And about 50 prompts later, it was working. And when I pressed go, it would just go on and on. I just casually posted it. It's like, hey, I prototyped an AI founder. Again, like I've done so many little projects, I wasn't really expecting much. But then the AI Doomer crowd found it, and it turned into a whole AGI Skynet conversation that came around. I was like, all right, this is some interesting attention. I see what they're saying. And I changed the objective to a more general, make the world a better place, make as many paper clips as possible. And I was like, okay, this does seem like a big step toward something that looks like AGI. This is an opportunity for me to kind of participate in this movement. I need a research paper. So I dropped my code into ChatGPT and said, can you write a scientific research paper for me? Like I've never written one before. And so the research paper I published, Task-Driven Autonomous Agent, the name, everything was just written by ChatGPT based on the code. And then I wanted a chart. So I looked up a couple of text-based chart languages and I found, I think it was Plant ULM and GraphViz. And so I asked it based on the code to basically output the flow into a chart, into a GraphViz chart, and then into a Plant ULM chart. And I had to do a little couple tweaks, but I could copy paste that output into a free tool online and generate those graphs. So the 3 graphs on the report, 2 were generated by ChatGPT. And then I fed the research paper into ChatGPT to write the Twitter thread.
Holy cow.
That was probably like 2-3 hours of work over the course of 3 days, to be honest.
That's nuts. Just hearing how savvy you are with using ChatGPT and just throughout the entire process, from the research paper to the tweets and to the charting. Those are use cases that I may not have even thought about. That's incredible. And so the AGI doomsdayers, there's a lot of them out there. It's understandable. We also had, what was it, the 6-month ban that was proposed a little while ago. And so some folks that were proposing, we just put a pause on everything in the meantime. Where do you stand in this like side of the discussion that AGI is inevitable and it's going to be terrible, we should take a pause, we should reevaluate, versus let's just continue building and let's be optimistic and program these technologies to benefit humanity?
It was interesting. I talked to a lot of people. I didn't want to be irresponsible, right? I wanted to respect these concerns. So I talked to a lot of people. And after having been exposed to a lot of these conversations, it became pretty clear to me that other people were already working on it or working on this technology. And as someone who accidentally built it, I learned a lot from people about why it could be hurtful, like beyond just the general high level theories. And also a lot of ideas were thrown out on things that could be implemented to make it more secure. And I thought that public discourse was extremely valuable. I decided to leave. I thought this does seem like the right approach to go about it. If there are going to be people building a dangerous technology, it should not be done privately behind closed doors where no one else gets to see it or comment or make suggestions on it, on why it might be bad for us.
And so you had open source Baby AGI. How's that experience been of managing this open source software that has taken off?
I mean, it's been about, what, two days now? I didn't actually know what it meant to manage an open source project. I thought managing an open source project was clicking the MIT license and pressing go. I started doing some pull requests. I'd never done any before. I resolved my first conflict yesterday. I don't understand all the codes that's being pulled in, so I've started discussions with other people who can help me manage it. I'm working on setting up a Discord. All in all, a little bit overwhelmed, but also more excited than anything.
Is any part of you scared for where this technology might be headed, or are you fairly optimistic about where we're going to take it?
There's going to be benefits and there's going to be cons. Like the internet's absolutely great, but there's a lot of issues with it. The mobile phones are great, but there's a lot of issues with it. Same with cars. There's a lot of issues with it that we have to be mindful of, but there's a lot of benefits as well. And I think as a society, we should have open discussions around all technology on how do we get the most benefit and value to the world while diminishing the potential downsides. And I think that's an important conversation to have actively.
Yeah, very well said. What's the future of Baby AGI look like? Also curious about what's the next project that you have in mind, if you're comfortable sharing it.
Oh, actually, I do have a project I built and I haven't shared yet. So I guess that would technically be my next project, but I'm not going to touch on that. Today's April 5th, so we're 2 days after I open source Baby AGI. Right now, I like the idea of a core template, simple template that can go in a whole bunch of different directions because I'm seeing that it quickly gets opinionated. So what I'd love to figure out is a way to keep the baby simple, but figure out a way to point at all the expansion ideas and grow those. Maybe there's a couple of toddler AGIs that are opinionated versions of Baby AGI that's grown, and then they grow into other versions of the child AGI. But the idea of taking a core simple Baby AGI and then supporting opinionated expansions of it is something I'm really interested in figuring out how to do, whether it's as a company or a nonprofit or just as a side project.
There is a role for humans in these autonomous agents and just observing, just like monitoring, make sure that everything is on track, right? What's that look like for you right now? Is it just throwing test prompts, test tasks at it and seeing, hey, like where does the chain break?
Yeah, I tried LangChain, Zapier NLA, get it to do Google Drive text. I ran into a couple issues I haven't figured out how to solve yet. For me, I'm interested in seeing if I can build an AI founder. So that's still my interest. But I don't think that's Baby AGI. That's going to be a side. Let's chip away at this idea. I don't think it needs to happen immediately. What's funny is one of my build in public kind of rules for myself has been just doing it freely and working on what I want to at any moment. So this is a little bit different where I do feel like I need to focus on Baby AGI and give it the attention it deserves until I can at least set up an environment for people to at least support each other if I'm not able to jump in and do it.
You're raising a baby. That's a big responsibility here.
Takes a village.
Takes a village. That's hilarious. With Baby AGI, I'm so excited to see where that goes. I can feel the excitement on Twitter as well.
Regardless of what the project turns out to be, the stuff that people are building on top of it is really exciting. And that's really what I'm most excited about.
For sure. It's really healthy discourse, I think. It's important stuff that we're talking about and addressing, which is great to see. So switching gears to a more tactical level, I'm just curious about what your workflow looks like when you're creating these new tools, right? So there was a certain point when you were new to these technologies, like foundational models were relatively new to you and you hadn't used a framework like a LangChain. How did you dive in? What was a process of just understanding how this works? What did that look like?
I've been a no-coder for a while. Right by the time I started playing with these models, everything was running on no-code, all our founder portals, all of it is no-code. And I've used Zapier enough that I've written custom code to ping APIs, I ping Crunchbase via an API. After leaving the playground, the first thing I did was set up a Zapier integration to OpenAI. It wasn't even an integration, right? I was just using a code block or I think it was a webhook actually to ping OpenAI. And it was give the wrapper prompt, send the input in, user fills a form on the founder portal, ping the OpenAI webhook with this wrapper around the user input, and then email the founder the result with BCC. Very straightforward Zapier click and drag drop interface. And so that was really initially it. It was just using Zapier and just anywhere where I had a Zapier flow, I could just plug OpenAI in if I wanted to summarize something or if I want to extract data. And so that was my initial workflow. And eventually I set up the webhooks often enough that I was like, I need to just set up the plug integration directly because I'm typing in the same stuff over and over again. So that's when I built the Zapier OpenAI integration that was initially unofficial, which became official a month later.
So you started with no code. You eventually found a need to program something.
Going from no code, right? Initially it was all just using the Zapier. And at some point, I really wanted to have the live feedback. I was hacking together the response time by just emailing it to people because using no code, you can't actually get the result back in as easily. And so that's when I was like, I should figure out how to use code. And so I went to the playground and I had it teach me how to write Python Flask. So I'd never done Flask before. When I wanted to move to code, I think maybe ChatGPT was out, or I think it was maybe the playground, but I used that to build my first Python Flask app.
So ChatGPT or the GPT playground was how you learned to code in the first place.
I dabbled enough before, I saw JavaScript, jQuery, PHP, MySQL, I could dabble, but it was so fast to pick up Python Flask. I'm describing what I want, seeing the code, and then just debugging it. It's a really, really fast way to learn if you have some fundamentals.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. And in terms of like just the prompting and figuring out, you mentioned with, was it Baby Yohei, there was a like 50 prompts that you used to get to a certain point where you're like, this works. Let's go with this. What's your process for prompting?
I can talk about the initial prompt for the code. I had a pretty good idea. At this point, I've done enough that I can just write out the prompt that I want and it works pretty well. So in this case, I described the process I want to build. I actually said, I want to build an AI founder that does these things. I want you to use, and I mentioned like LangChain, Pinecone, because I was familiar with them and I had some code somewhere else. So I was like, okay, I can reuse that code if it breaks. But then I actually specified, because I knew it didn't have the documentation for this, said, you don't have the documentation for LangChain and Pinecone. You'll be provided that later. So just keep that blank for now. And then I wrote the whole code except missing those parts. And then the next step, I said, here's the LangChain documentation page for the functions that I need. Can you now write that function based on the documentation? And then I fed the Pinecone documentation. So it's first initial prompt and tell it to strip out stuff it doesn't know, and then tell it you will give it documentation. And then I fed it documentation until I wrote it. And then after that, it was a lot of like plugging in error codes until it gave you an answer. And if the answer didn't work, I would type the error code into Google, look for a couple answers and say, your solution's not working. Here's 5 suggestions I found across the web. Can you look at those and try another suggestion?
Man, that's incredible.
And I think that was it. I think it was pretty much just that kind of jumping back. It was like the second half was mostly just dropping in error codes until it fixed it.
Gotcha. That's fascinating. I love the scrappiness and just building these things out. And I'm sure that sort of inspires some of the work with the autonomous agent and with Baby AGI as well, just understanding how good ChatGPT is in the middle of this entire process. Like you can always sort of revert back to it to answer questions from a variety of different areas where you may be running into some hurdles. Super interesting. And curious to learn about like your perspectives on just the future of the space. You know better than anyone how powerful a technology like ChatGPT is, especially in the software development cycle. What types of things do you think that a tool like ChatGPT is not good at and may not be good at?
I think one of the challenges that it can do too much. So when somebody wants to do something and go there, you still have to tell it to become that and turn it into that. Even though it can do anything, there's a learning curve to get it to do anything. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges of ChatGPT and the opportunity that some people are finding to make it easier to use these technologies for a specific use case. And then let's say the coding is a great example, right? I told you how I can use prompts, but if somebody just built that, right, where you can describe what you want and then it automatically identifies like what technology is needed, goes and finds a dev doc from the web, feeds it in through a chain, and then we'll try to execute it. If the code doesn't work, it'll feed that back into GPT. So all you have to do is type in what you want and press go. Now even though ChatGPT can do it, abstracting away the need to learn how to use ChatGPT, I think there's still a lot of value there.
It almost like reducing its scope to a point where the results are a little bit more aligned with what you expect.
Yeah. Because it does take a little bit of practice and prompt engineering and whatnot to get what you're looking for. So building kind of opinionated solutions on top of ChatGPT for specific use cases is definitely an opportunity.
Do you imagine that we're going to live in a world where there's a ton of just foundational models that are maybe more specifically tailored for tasks instead of these very general models that we have? Or do you think we're just going to create guardrails again around these very general foundational models to do specific things?
I think you can guide the general models to do a lot of tasks overall. Yeah.
What is your hottest take about the future of AI? Do you have any spicy takes that maybe the majority of folks may not agree with?
No, I don't think so. I'm like, most of my takes are like, I like shooting straight down the middle that doesn't upset anybody. When I think about like mobile phones and cars, right? Everyone said they're going to take over the world, but there's still people who don't have mobile phones in the world. There's still people who don't drive cars in the world. There's still people who don't have computers or have access to internet. I think AI will be everywhere, but it also won't be like everywhere.
Gotcha. To some, that might be a hot take. What are you most excited about in the future of AI, like next 5 years, 10 years?
I think the idea of having technology counterparts that we can work alongside that are executing tasks where we can really focus on managing, I think is really fascinating. I don't think we're that far from being able to run a farm run by robots where you're just making sure they don't break.
Does the role of management become smaller and smaller over time? Or do you think there's always going to be a role for humans to manage in that situation?
I think what's going to happen, again, is a lot of people are going to move from doing to managing. Lowest level human employee at a company might be managing bots and AI, right? So I think the skill set of managing becomes increasingly important. I do believe there's going to be a new field of study around managing kind of AI agents and how we do that. I think there are learnings from managing humans that apply in terms of efficiency, but also learnings that don't translate, such as emotion.
Super, super interesting.
What will happen is hopefully, right, that we produce more. Right? The goal here is that we don't have issues with not having enough food and that we're able to have an abundant society. Again, AI is not going to solve everything, but it can help.
If you would have advice for somebody born in recent times when they're of age to understand what's going on with the world as to what careers to pursue, what skills to develop, what advice might you give?
I don't think I could give advice to somebody born now on what careers to pursue because the world will be so different by the time they're thinking about it. But for people thinking now, absolutely you should be looking at how these new AI technologies apply into whatever field you're interested in. I think it's important that you find something you're interested in, right? As this whatever space or industry or something that excites you. I do think there are probably opportunities to apply the most recent AI into that field. And if you start thinking about it, you will be one of the earlier people thinking about that. And if you start talking to people about it, writing about it, you'll quickly find yourself surrounded with other people thinking about that, which is exactly who you probably want to work with.
Well said. Yohei, that was super informative. Really enjoyed the conversation. Where can people find you? Where can people follow along with all the cool stuff that you're working on?
Twitter is probably where I'm most active. If you don't follow me, Yohei Nakajima, you'll see there that I have a built-in public log, which is where you can see the stuff I build on the side. But again, my main journey is Untapped Capital and growing a venture fund. And you can read more about that at untapped.vc.
Love it. Thanks again, Yohei, for taking the time and super excited to follow along.
Thank you.